The glass made it worse because it meant I could see everything and everyone could see me. Midnight turned the laundromat into a fishbowl dropped into darkness. Inside, the fluorescent glare stayed brutally bright, flattening every surface into harsh whites and sickly blues. Outside, the parking lot dissolved into shadow, the sodium lamps at the far edge barely reaching the windows. The effect was unmissable. Me, alone and exposed, framed perfectly behind floor-to-ceiling glass, surrounded by a night that felt thick enough to press against the building. My parents called it keeping an eye on the place. I called it punishment. I worked the overnight shift because I was the only one who could. College classes during the day. Tuition that never seemed to shrink no matter how many checks I deposited. The family laundromat paid just enough to make the exhaustion feel necessary. At night, the machine sounded different. Washers didn't slosh. They churned. Dryers didn't hum. They roared and rattled like something struggling to breathe. The air was heavy with detergent and warm metal, a smell that clung to my clothes long after I left, and I learned quickly that the hardest part of the shift wasn't staying awake, it was realizing how visible I was. I sat behind the counter near the change machine, laptop open but untouched. Most nights were empty, maybe one or two insomniacs folding clothes with headphones in, never meeting my eyes. Tonight, there was no one.
The bell above the door chimed softly. I looked up. A man stood just inside the entrance. He wore a dark hoodie with the hood pulled low, hands in his pockets. He didn't carry a laundry bag. He didn't even glance at the rows of machines. He just stood there, letting the door close behind him, the glass reflecting his shape back at itself. "Hey," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "We're open." He didn't respond. He started walking. Not toward the washers, not toward the dryers, just through the aisles. Slowly, too slowly, his steps dragged slightly, shoes whispering against tile as he passed machines without looking at them. I watched him from the counter, every muscle tightening. Customers wandered sometimes, especially late at night, but they usually announced themselves with noise, with purpose. This man moved like he was measuring the space, mapping it. "Can I help you with something?" I asked. He paused for a moment. I thought he might turn around. Instead, he tilted his head slightly like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. Then he continued walking. My skin prickled. I stood up. The counter suddenly feeling too low, too inadequate a barrier. He reached the back of the laundromat near the hallway that led to the storage room and office. He stopped there facing the closed door, just stood close enough that I imagined I could hear his breathing if the machines ever stopped. Then he turned and walked back the way he'd come, same pace, same dragging steps. He didn't look at me as he passed, didn't acknowledge me at all. He reached the door, pulled it open, and left. The bell chimed again. I stayed standing long after he was gone, listening to the washer spin to my own pulse, thewing in my ears. My reflection in the glass looked too sharp, too awake. When I finally sat back down, my hands shook. I told myself it was over. Weird people wandered in sometimes. That was part of working nights. 10 minutes later, I noticed him outside. He stood near the edge of the parking lot, just beyond the reach of the nearest light. His hoodie blended into the darkness so completely that at first I thought he was just another shadow. He was facing the laundromat, facing me. I couldn't see his eyes through the glass, but I knew that he was looking straight at me at the counter at the exact spot where I sat framed in fluorescent glare. I stood up again, heart racing. He didn't move. I picked up my phone and pretended to scroll, angling my body away from the windows. When I glanced back, he was still there, unmoving, watching. Minutes stretched. My mouth went dry. Eventually, he stepped back into the darkness and vanished. I didn't relax. Not really. The rest of the shift unraveled slowly after that. The machine seemed louder. Every reflection in the glass startled me. I checked the time every few minutes, counting down until dawn. That was when I heard the noise from the back. It wasn't loud, just a muted scrape, like something shifting against concrete. The sound came from the storage room, the area behind the staff, only door where detergent pallets and broken machines waited for repair. I froze. Another scrape followed, then a soft thud. My thoughts raced. Maybe a raccoon had gotten in. Maybe something had fallen. But the memory of the man in the hoodie pressed in, heavy and undeniable. I stood and walked slowly toward the back, every step reluctant. The hallway light flickered on automatically, revealing the familiar clutter. Boxes, carts, the closed storage room door at the end. I stopped a few feet away. The smell reached me first. Stale sweat, sour breath, human enclosed. The door handle moved just a fraction enough to tell me someone was on the other side. I backed away so fast I nearly tripped. No thinking, just movement. I turned and ran for the back exit, the quickest way out, closer than the front door. My hand slammed into the metal handle and I yanked. It didn't budge. I pulled again harder. Nothing. My eyes dropped to the handle. A rope was wrapped around it. Not professionally, not neatly, just looped and knotted tight. Threaded through the handle and around the exterior security bar. Pulled until the metal groaned under the tension. My breath left me in a soundless rush. He hadn't just come inside. He'd prepared. A noise came from behind me. The storage room door opening. I spun. He stood in the doorway, hoodie still up, face half, hidden by shadow. Up close, the smell was overwhelming. Unwashed skin, old breath, the stench of someone who had been waiting too long in confined spaces. He took one step toward me. I screamed. The sound tore out of my throat, raw and animal. I lunged for the tied door, fingers clawing at the rope. The fibers burned my skin as I yanked, panic lending me strength I didn't know I had. The knot shifted behind me. Footsteps accelerated. I pulled again. The rope loosened just enough to slip free from the handle. I threw my weight against the door and felt it give. I burst into the night, stumbling into the parking lot, the cold air shocking my lungs. I ran toward the lights, screaming until my voice broke. When I looked back, he was already gone. The police came. Statements, flashlights cutting through shadow. They found the rope. They found footprints near the storage room. They didn't find him. The realization settled in slowly, long after the building emptied and the sun came up. He hadn't been wandering. He'd been setting a trap. And I'd been standing in the middle of it, bright and visible, thinking I was alone.
The first thing I noticed was the disturbance, because in a building that empty, there should not have been one at all. It was not loud. It was not even clearly a noise at first, just a low, padded thud from somewhere below my floor, as if a heavy object had shifted and then settled carefully back into place. I stopped typing and waited, fingers resting on the keys, listening to the fifth floor breathe around me. The office had its own nighttime personality. During the day, it buzzed with phones, printers, voices overlapping in messy layers. After hours, it became restrained, almost watchful. Fluorescent panels hummed overhead. The carpet absorbed footsteps. The air conditioning cycled in long, tired bursts that made the whole place feel like it was exhaling. I worked late more often than I admitted to my friends. Data entry was easier when no one interrupted me. When the numbers flowed cleanly from spreadsheet to system, without small talk or questions. I had planned to leave by 9, then 10. Then after I finished one last batch, the disturbance came again. This time, a faint rustle, like fabric, dragging across carpet tiles. I slid my headphones off one ear and tilted my head. The sound came from below, maybe the 4th floor. The building settled, or at least that's what it sounded like. Instead of sitting there, overthinking it, I turned the volume up on my headphones and let the soft drone of instrumental music fill my ears. The spreadsheet snapped back into focus. Columns, rows, control. A few minutes passed before something tugged at my attention again. Not a noise exactly, but an absence. The HVAC cycle didn't kick back on when it should have. The office felt warmer, sealed. I rolled my shoulders, tension I hadn't noticed, easing just slightly, and glanced up. That was when I saw the utility door. It was at the far end of the 5th floor, recessed into an alcove near the stairwell. Beige metal, usually locked, usually ignored. It stood open, not wide, just enough to expose a vertical slice of shadow behind it. The fluorescence didn't reach inside. The darkness there looked dense, like something you could step into and disappear. I stared at it longer than made sense, trying to remember if it had been like that earlier. I replayed my arrival in my head. Badge swipe, elevator ride, lights coming on Roby Row. I couldn't recall passing the door at all. I stood and walked toward it, my footsteps vanishing into the carpet. The closer I got, the more the air changed, warm or stale. And then the smell reached me. Not mold, not dust, human stale sweat and unwashed hair, layered with a sour reek of a mouth that hadn't seen toothpaste in days. It was intimate in the worst way. The kind of smell that meant someone had been breathing in a confined space for a long time. My stomach tightened. I pushed the door shut quickly, not slamming it, but not gentle either. It resisted for half a second, as if something inside had been too close to the frame, then closed with a dull metallic click. I stood there, heart ticking too fast, listening. Nothing. I realized my shoulders were practically up around my ears. When they finally dropped, I let out a slow breath I hadn't known I was holding. I went back to my desk and sat down, but the numbers on the screen no longer flowed. Every cell felt like a placeholder for something else. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened window, face lit from below by the monitor's glow, eyes sharper, more alert than they had been 10 minutes earlier. I didn't put my headphones back on. That was when the sensation started. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't even fear yet. It was the awareness of being oriented toward, like, standing with your back to a door and knowing without turning that someone is there. I kept typing anyway, one line. 2. Then the overhead fluorescence went out. Not all at once, not dramatically. They simply timed out. One by one, the panels above my section of cubicles clicked off, plunging my desk into shadow. The rest of the floor followed in a soft cascade, illumination retreating until the only remaining glow came from my monitor. I froze. The office lighting ran on motion sensors. Everyone knew that. Wave your arms, stand up, take a few steps, and the fluorescence would snap back on. I didn't move. The silence sharpened immediately, without the hum of lights or the low churn of the HVAC. The building felt hollowed out. My screen cast a cool blue glare over my hands, the edge of my desk, my coffee mug. Everything beyond that narrow halo dissolved into blackness and shadow. I sat perfectly still, terrified of what movement would announce. That was when I heard the footsteps. They were close enough that I could tell they were on carpet, heavy, damp, carefully placed. Each one arrived with intent, a slow compression of fibers followed by a subtle drag, as if the person walking didn't lift their feet all the way. They stopped just outside the glow of my screen. I stared into the void beyond my desk, eyes burning, afraid to blink. If I moved, the lights would come back on. If the lights came back on, whoever was out there would see exactly where I was. The footsteps resumed. One, pause. Another closer now. I felt my pulse in my throat, in my fingertips. My hands trembled against the keyboard. I thought about the utility closet, the smell, how long someone would have had to sit in there for it to linger like that. I whispered, "Hello." The word barely existed. It felt absorbed by the room. No answer, just the careful approach continuing, staying just beyond illumination. Like whoever it was understood the sensors better than I did. I stood up. The fluorescence didn't come on immediately. That delay, barely a second, was enough to convince me. They were standing closer than I'd thought. I ran. The lights snapped back to life behind me as I bolted between cubicles. But I didn't look back. I clipped a partition, pain flaring in my arm, and kept going. The stairwell door loomed ahead, its exit sign glowing red and reassuring. I hit the door hard and fumbled the handle behind me. Footsteps accelerated, no longer cautious, no longer hiding. The door gave way, and I spilled into the stairwell, concrete echoing my panic as I took the steps 2 at a time. The harsh stairwell illumination flickered on, exposing nothing behind me but empty space and a slowly closing door. I didn't stop until I reached the lobby. Burly man, tan skin, buzz, cut hair, wearing a light blue security uniform with a badge. The night guard looked up from his desk as I stumbled toward him, "Hey, what's wrong?" he asked, already standing. "There's someone upstairs," I said. My voice sounded wrong, scraped thin on 5. He didn't hesitate. He pulled the camera feeds up immediately, rewinding with practice movements. I stood beside him, arms wrapped around myself, watching the 5th floor from a distance that suddenly felt obscene. We saw my desk, the motion sensor, lights clicking off, my stillness. Then the utility door opened. A figure eased out, staying just beyond the monitor's glow, head angled as if listening to my breathing. It followed me when I ran, never fully entering the light. My stomach twisted. Then behind us, the stairwell door handle moved just slightly. A slow testing turn. Burly man, tan skin, buzz, cut hair, wearing a light blue security uniform with a badge. Noticed it at the same moment I did. His hand hovered over the radio. The handle stopped. Sirens arrived minutes later, but the waiting stretched unbearably thin. When police cleared the building, they found the intruder back in the utility closet, pressed into the narrow space behind the panels. He didn't speak. He didn't resist. They said he'd been there for hours. They said he'd been watching. I don't work in offices anymore, but sometimes, when I'm sitting alone in my living room and a light bulb flickers or a room goes dim, I freeze, terrified that if I move to fix it, I'll bump into someone standing right in front of me in the shadow, already knowing exactly where I am. The back door wasn't wide open. It was worse than that, just barely unlatched, like someone had changed their mind halfway through leaving. I noticed it because the cold got in first. A thin stripe of winter air slid across the concrete floor and wrapped around my ankles, sharp enough to cut through my boots. The warehouse was supposed to be sealed tight overnight, climate-controlled, predictable. I stopped just inside the entrance, badge still warm from the scanner, and stared at the door at the far end of the loading bay. It wasn't something you'd see if you were rushing. It wasn't dramatic. The heavy metal door sat flush in its frame, lightless, quiet, except the latch wasn't fully seated. A hairline gap, enough for air, enough for doubt. I stood there longer than I meant to, listening to the familiar hum of the fluorescents overhead. They buzzed with that faint electrical whine that never shut off. The sound I'd come to associate with safety, with routine, with knowing exactly what was around me. My name is Simple Vector Cartoon Man. Tired expression, dark circles under eyes. Wearing a dark blue security uniform jacket with a generic yellow badge patch, dark work pants, and heavy black boots, often holding a brown clipboard or a black flashlight. And I worked the graveyard shift because I was good at convincing myself nothing was wrong. I walked toward the door, boots echoing softly through the cavernous space. The warehouse stretched out on either side of me. Active aisles lit in hard white light, pallets stacked with surgical neatness, barcode scanners blinking patiently in their docks. Everything looked exactly as it should. I nudged the door shut with my foot. The latch clicked into place. "There," I muttered, mostly to hear my own voice. People forgot things. Day shift rushed. That was all. I turned on my heel and headed deeper into the building, clipboard tucked under my arm, starting the slow circuit I'd done at H100 times before. Inventory checks, door seals, temperature gauges, the kind of work that lulled you into thinking boredom was the biggest danger. The unused section sat at the far end of the warehouse beyond the last active aisle. No reason to go back there unless something went wrong. The lights were off to save power, leaving the space swallowed in shadow. Even from a distance, it felt different, like the darkness there had weight. I avoided looking at it. That was the first lie I told myself. The second came an hour later when I saw movement. It happened at the edge of my vision as I scanned a pallet label. A blur, just a suggestion of motion between two tall shelves. I looked up immediately. Nothing. The aisle was empty, perfectly aligned, brightly lit. I laughed under my breath, sharp and humorless. Get some sleep. Simple Vector, Cartoon Man. Tired expression, dark circles under eyes, wearing a dark blue security uniform jacket with a generic yellow badge patch, dark work pants, and heavy black boots, often holding a brown clipboard or a black flashlight. Exhaustion played tricks. Everyone knew that. You saw things. Your brain filled in gaps. I checked my watch and forced myself to keep moving, but the feeling didn't go away. As I walked, I became acutely aware of my own noise, the scuff of my boots, the rustle of my jacket, the faint jingle of keys at my hip. The warehouse answered every sound, with an echo, metallic, and delayed, like the building was repeating me just to prove it could. I told myself that was normal too. The second time I saw it, I didn't laugh. This time, the movement was slower, a shape sliding back behind a stack of crates in the unused section. Just long enough to register height with the absence of reflection, my pulse kicked up. I stood very still, clipboard pressed to my chest, listening. The fluorescence hummed. Somewhere far off, a machine cycled with a dull mechanical clank. Nothing else. I took one step toward the dark. "Hello," I called. My voice sounded small, swallowed by distance. No answer came back. I should have called security then. That's what the manual said. Any anomaly, any uncertainty, report it. Let someone else handle it. Instead, I walked forward. Each step toward the unused section felt like crossing a boundary I couldn't name. The bright aisles fell away behind me, replaced by shadow and the cold smell of old metal and dust. My flashlight cut a narrow beam ahead, carving shapes out of the gloom shelves, forgotten pallets, shrink wrap hanging like dead skin. I told myself I was being thorough, professional. The silence back there was different, heavier. The hum of the lights didn't reach this far. Every sound I made felt amplified, then distorted by distance. That's when the banging started. It exploded through the warehouse without warning. A violent metallic thud that slammed into the walls and came back doubled, tripled, echoing until I couldn't tell where it had started. I jumped so hard my flashlight skidded across the concrete. My heart roared in my ears loud enough that for a second, I didn't hear the second sound. Tap tap, not random, not chaotic measured. The tapping came from somewhere behind the shelves. Metal, striking metal with deliberate spacing. Each tap landed with a pause between long enough for dread to bloom. My chest tightened. My breathing went shallow and fast. I stood frozen, light trembling in my grip, watching the beam shake across the darkness. "Stop," I whispered, though I didn't know who I was talking to. The tapping stopped for a moment. There was nothing but my heartbeat syncing instinctively to the rhythm that had just ended. Then something shifted. A footstep. Careful, unhurried. It wasn't coming toward me. It was circling. The realization landed cold and clear. Whoever was back there knew the layout, knew where the blind spots were. They weren't lost. They weren't panicking. They were pacing. I backed up slowly, every instinct screaming now, denial finally cracking under the weight of too many coincidences. The flashlight beam caught a smear of grime on the floor, fresh enough to still look damp. A footprint. I turned and ran. The warehouse swallowed me as I sprinted back toward the lit aisles, my footsteps crashing and echoing wildly. Somewhere behind me, another metallic bang rang out, closer this time, followed by the same rhythmic tapping, faster now, as if in response. I didn't look back. I burst into the main area and nearly collided with a support pillar, my shoulder slamming into cold steel. Pain flared, but I kept moving, fumbling for my radio with numb fingers. Security. I gasped into it. I need help. There's someone inside. The reply crackled back, calm and distant. Copy that. Stay where you are. Is greater than, police are on the way. Stay where I was. The words felt absurd in a building this big. I pressed myself against a pallet stack, trying to make myself small, listening as the echoes faded. The tapping stopped. The banging didn't return. Silence crept back in, slow and deliberate. Too deliberate. The police arrived minutes later, though it felt like hours. Floodlights snapped on. Voices filled the space, authoritative and grounding. I didn't move until an officer touched my arm gently and asked my name. They found him behind a row of shelves in the unused section, crouched low, clothes layered and filthy, eyes tracking every movement. He didn't fight, didn't speak. Security footage did the rest. They showed it to me later after my hand stopped shaking for a week. A man had been walking the perimeter of the warehouse at night, testing doors, lingering just out of camera range, timing patrols. The back door I'd noticed wasn't the first one he tried, just the one he'd nearly succeeded with. They called him the Pacer. I call him the reason I stopped ignoring that quiet voice in my head. The one that notices the latch that isn't quite right, the shadow that lingers too long, the sound that doesn't belong. Because denial isn't bravery. And sometimes the scariest thing isn't being watched. It's realizing how hard you worked to convince yourself you weren't.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe, or follow for more stories on Fun Tales for All.